The U.S. Valor moved through the ocean, cutting through the waves like a silent guardian. It was not an ordinary hospital ship. Most hospital ships were white, marked with a red cross, and carried only medical supplies and doctors. But the Valor was different. It was built for war. Its steel gray body carried heavy weapons. It had thick armor and advanced radar systems. It was a floating fortress, ready for both battle and healing. Captain Michael Reynolds stood on the bridge, looking at the horizon. He was a tall man with sharp blue eyes and short dark hair. He had served in the Navy for 20 years. His face was calm, but his mind was always working. He knew danger could come at any time. His job was to keep his crew and patients safe. Below deck, Lieutenant Sarah Carter walked through the medical bay. She was a skilled trauma surgeon with years of experience. She had seen war before. She had saved lives in the worst conditions. But she had never been on a ship like this. The Valor was not just a hospital. It was also a warship. Sarah had joined the mission thinking she would only treat the wounded. But as soon as she stepped on board, she realized this was not a normal medical mission. The ship had weapons. It had soldiers. It had security teams walking the hallways. She felt uneasy. She had always believed in saving lives, not taking them. She walked into the main medical area. Rows of beds were ready for patients. Machines beeped softly. Nurses checked supplies. Dr. Anthony Brooks, a senior doctor, nodded at her as she entered. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and kind brown eyes. "Welcome to the Valor, Lieutenant," he said. "It's different from what you expected, isn't it?" Sarah sighed. "I thought I was coming to a hospital ship. This looks more like a war zone." Dr. Brooks smiled slightly. "It's both. You'll get used to it." Before Sarah could respond, a voice came through the ship's communication system. "Captain to all stations. We have received a distress call. Prepare for incoming wounded." Sarah felt her heart beat faster. A distress call meant people were hurt. She quickly grabbed her medical kit and moved to her station. The entire ship became busy. Medics prepared stretchers. Nurses set up IVs. The ship's engines roared as the Valor changed course. On the bridge, Captain Reynolds studied the distress signal. A convoy of Allied soldiers had been attacked. They were under heavy fire. Some were dead, many were wounded. The enemy was still nearby. Lieutenant Ryan Foster, the ship's defense officer, looked at the captain. "Sir, the enemy forces are still in the area. If we go in, we might have to fight." Reynolds nodded. "We're not running from a fight. The Valor can handle itself. We're going in." The crew moved quickly. The ship's weapons were activated. The radar scanned the area. Medical teams prepared for mass casualties. Sarah stood by the operating table, her hand steady. She had been in tough situations before, but never on a ship that was also heading into battle. As the Valor approached the convoy, alarms rang. Enemy ships were nearby. The Valor's weapons locked on targets. The battle had begun. Captain Reynolds gave the order. "Fire." The Valor's cannons roared. Missiles flew through the sky. The enemy ships fired back. Explosions lit up the ocean. The ship shook, but the crew held their ground. Amid the chaos, helicopters carrying the wounded arrived. Sarah and her team ran to the deck. Soldiers carried injured men and women from the helicopters. Blood stained their uniforms. Some screamed in pain. Others were silent, unconscious. Sarah took a deep breath. This was her job. She couldn't think about the battle. She had to save lives. She checked the first patient. A young Marine, barely 20, had a gunshot wound to his chest. "Get him to surgery," she shouted. Another soldier, Sergeant James Mitchell, was badly injured. He had shrapnel in his leg and was losing blood fast. "Stay with me," Sarah told him. "You're going to be okay." Mitchell gritted his teeth. "I didn't think a hospital ship would be in a battle." Sarah gave him a small smile. "Neither did I." The medical team worked fast. The sound of gunfire echoed outside, but inside the medical bay, All focus was on saving lives. Sarah stitched wounds, stopped bleeding, and stabilized patients. Hours passed, but she didn't stop. Finally, the ship's alarms quieted. The battle was over. The enemy had retreated. The Valor had won. Captain Reynolds entered the medical bay. He looked around at the wounded. Some had survived because of the Valor. Others hadn't been so lucky. He walked up to Sarah. "How many did we lose?" Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead. 5 didn't make it. The rest are stable for now. Reynolds nodded. "You did good work today." Sarah sighed. "I just wish we didn't have to do this at all." The smell of blood and antiseptic filled the air in the medical bay of the U.S. Valor. Sarah Carter wiped her hands on her uniform, trying to catch her breath. The last battle had left many wounded, and the doctors and nurses had worked through the night. Some soldiers survived. Some didn't. It was the harsh truth of war. Captain Michael Reynolds stood on the bridge, looking at the horizon. The battle was over, but the war was not. He knew the enemy would not stop. The attack on the convoy was not random. Something bigger was happening. Lieutenant Ryan Foster, the ship's defense officer, approached him. "Sir, we picked up a weak distress signal from another convoy. It's not far from our location. They might be under attack." Reynolds nodded. "Set course." We move fast. The U.S. Valor changed direction, heading straight for the new danger. The engines roared, and the ship cut through the waves like a predator. Sarah felt the ship moving and knew what it meant. More wounded were coming. She turned to Dr. Anthony Brooks. "We're not done yet." Brooks nodded. "We never are." The enemy attack had been brutal. When the Valor arrived at the scene, the convoy was in flames. Smoke rose into the sky. Ships were sinking, and the sound of gunfire echoed over the water. "Damn it," Reynolds muttered. "They didn't stand a chance." Ryan scanned the radar. "Sir, we have enemy ships nearby. They're still attacking." Reynolds gritted his teeth. Battle stations. The U.S. Valor fired its cannons. Missiles shot through the sky. The enemy ships fought back, their weapons lighting up. The U.S. Valor moved through the dark waters, its engines humming softly. The battle was over, but the crew had no time to rest. The wounded needed care, the ship needed repairs, and Captain Michael Reynolds needed answers. In the medical bay, Sarah Carter worked tirelessly. She stitched wounds, checked bandages, and gave medicine to ease the pain of the injured soldiers. Her hands were steady, but her mind was troubled. Something about the last attack didn't feel right. Dr. Anthony Brooks stood beside her, watching as she treated a young Marine. "You look worried," he said. Sarah sighed. This attack felt planned. The enemy knew where the convoy would be. They were waiting. Brooks nodded. "You think someone gave them information?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't want to believe it, but the thought stayed in her mind. Someone might be betraying them. On the bridge, Reynolds studied the reports from the battle. Lieutenant Ryan Foster stood next to him, scanning the radar. "We found something strange, sir," Ryan said, pointing to the screen. Before the attack, there was an unusual signal coming from the convoy. It was a short transmission, sent right before the enemy arrived. Reynolds frowned. "Someone on our side sent that signal." Ryan nodded. "It looks like it. The enemy didn't just find the convoy by luck. They were guided." Reynolds clenched his jaw. A traitor. Someone on their side was helping the enemy. "Can we track where the signal came from?" he asked. Ryan shook his head. The source was hidden, but it had to be close. Someone on one of the ships sent it. Reynolds turned to his crew. "We need to find out who's behind this." The ship continued its journey, heading toward a nearby port where they could refuel and gather supplies. Reynolds saw this as an opportunity. If there was a traitor on board, they might try to contact the enemy again. Ryan put together a small team for a secret mission. They would go into the port and gather information. If there was a traitor, maybe they could find out who it was. Sarah wasn't part of the mission, but she wanted to help. "Let me come with you," she told Ryan. "I can blend in. People talk to doctors." Ryan hesitated. It could be dangerous. Sarah crossed her arms. "So is surgery. I can handle it." Ryan finally agreed, and they prepared for the mission. The port was busy with ships, traders, and soldiers. It was a place where people sold supplies, gathered information, and sometimes made illegal deals. Ryan and Sarah walked through the narrow streets, keeping their eyes open. They entered a small shop where a man named Victor, a known information dealer, worked. Ryan leaned against the counter. "We're looking for news about the last battle." Victor raised an eyebrow. "News isn't free." Ryan placed a small stack of money on the counter. "Now it is." Victor took the money and smiled. "Word is, someone on your side is selling secrets. The enemy pays well for good information." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you know who it is?" Victor shook his head. "Not yet, but I do know they'll send another message soon, probably from the port." Ryan thanked him and left quickly. They had to act fast. Back on the Valor, Reynolds received Ryan's report. They had to catch the traitor before they could send another message. Ryan set up a trap. He had his team watch all communication points in the port. If the traitor tried to send a signal, they would catch them. Hours passed. Then, a soldier named Mark Jensen was seen sneaking toward a secured communication station. He tapped on a small device, sending a signal. Ryan and his team moved fast. "Hands up," Ryan ordered. Jensen froze, then tried to run. But he didn't get far. The security team tackled him to the ground. Back on the Valor, Reynolds stood in front of Jensen. "Why did you do it?" he demanded. Jensen looked down. "They paid me. They promised me safety. I didn't want to die in this war." Reynolds shook his head. "Because of you, good soldiers died." Jensen had nothing to say. He knew it was true. Reynolds turned to Ryan. "Lock him up. We'll deal with him later." Sarah watched from a distance. She had feared there was a traitor, and now they had proof. But something still didn't feel right. "This isn't over," she murmured. "There's more to this than one man." And deep down, she knew she was right. The U.S. Valor sailed away from the port, moving back into open waters. The traitor, Mark Jensen, was locked in a secure room under heavy guard. But even though he was caught, Captain Michael Reynolds and his crew knew the danger was not over. In the medical bay, Sarah Carter finished checking on the wounded soldiers. Many were recovering, but some were still in serious condition. She walked over to Sergeant James Mitchell's bed. He was awake now, sitting up and drinking water. "You're looking better," she said. Mitchell grinned. "Feels good to be alive." Sarah smiled, but her mind was still troubled. "Something about this mission doesn't make sense," she said. "Catching Jensen should have made me feel better, but it doesn't." Mitchell's smile faded. "You think there's more to it?" Sarah nodded. "I do." On the bridge, Reynolds and Lieutenant Ryan Foster studied the reports from the intelligence team. Jensen had admitted to sending messages to the enemy, but he refused to say who he was working for. Reynolds wasn't convinced he had acted alone. "Someone higher up gave him orders," Reynolds said. "We need to find out who." Ryan looked at the radar. "Sir, there's something strange. A ship appeared on our radar for a few seconds, then disappeared. It's like someone is watching us." Reynolds' expression hardened. "We need to stay alert. Keep scanning for any unusual activity." Later that night, Sarah was finishing her rounds when she noticed something odd. A young sailor named Ethan Walker was moving quickly through the hallway, looking over his shoulder as if he didn't want to be seen. Sarah frowned. She wasn't the type to spy on people, but something about his behavior seemed suspicious. She followed him at a distance. Walker entered a storage room. Sarah waited a few seconds, then slowly pushed the door open. Inside, she saw him using a small communication device. He was whispering into it. "They know about Jensen, but they don't suspect anything else. The mission continues as planned." Sarah's heart pounded. Another traitor. And this one was still feeding information to the enemy. She didn't have a weapon, but she knew she had to act. Stepping forward, she spoke firmly. "Put the device down, Walker." Walker spun around, his face going pale. "Lieutenant Carter." Before he could react, Sarah grabbed a metal tray from a shelf and swung it hard against his arm. The device fell to the ground. Walker cursed and lunged at her, but she dodged to the side. She grabbed a fire extinguisher and hit him in the stomach, knocking him down. Walker groaned in pain as Sarah grabbed the radio on her belt. "Security to storage room. Now." Seconds later, armed guards rushed in, pulling Walker to his feet and securing him in handcuffs. Reynolds and Ryan arrived moments later. Ryan picked up the communication device and examined it. He was sending messages. "We need to find out what they said." Reynolds looked at Walker with cold eyes. So Jensen wasn't the only one. Walker sneered. "You think you've won. You have no idea what's coming." Reynolds stepped closer. "Then tell me." Walker laughed but said nothing more. The guards dragged him away, locking him in another secure room. The next morning, the intelligence team decrypted Walker's messages. The results were alarming. He wasn't just sending information, Ryan said. He was calling for an attack. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "When?" Ryan looked grim. "Soon." Reynolds turned to the crew. "We prepare for battle." The U.S. Valor was in danger, and this time, the enemy was coming straight for them. The air on the U.S. Valor was thick with tension. Captain Michael Reynolds stood on the bridge, looking at the radar screen. The enemy was coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Lieutenant Ryan Foster checked the latest signals. "Sir, we have movement. Multiple enemy ships heading straight for us." Reynolds nodded. "Battle stations." Alarms rang through the ship. Soldiers ran to their posts. The medical team prepared for incoming casualties. Dr. Anthony Brooks and Sarah Carter checked their supplies. They knew they would soon be busy. Sarah glanced at Brooks. "Are we ready for this?" Brooks sighed. "We have no choice." The enemy fleet was massive. Warships, fast attack boats, even aircraft. The U.S. Valor was strong, but it was one ship against many. Reynolds gave the order. "Fire." Cannons roared. Missiles streaked through the sky. The ocean lit up with explosions. The battle had begun. Enemy ships fired back. The Valor shook as a missile hit its side. Ryan held onto the control panel. "We took a hit, but we're still in the fight." Reynolds gritted his teeth. "We don't back down." The U.S. Valor moved fast, dodging attacks and striking back with force. Its advanced defenses held strong. The crew fought with everything they had. In the medical bay, chaos erupted as the wounded arrived. Blood stained the floors. Soldiers screamed in pain. Sarah and Brooks worked quickly. A young Marine grabbed Sarah's hand. "Am I going to make it?" She forced a smile. "You're in good hands." She didn't stop moving, one patient after another. She couldn't think about the battle. She could only think about saving lives. Then the ship shook violently, a massive explosion. The lights flickered. The power struggled to stay on. Brooks looked at Sarah. That was close. Sarah swallowed hard. Too close. On the bridge, Ryan checked the systems. "Sir, we lost one of our defensive guns." Reynolds clenched his fists. The enemy was closing in. If they didn't do something fast, they would be overwhelmed. Then Ryan had an idea. "Sir, what if we use the drones to distract them? Get them to focus on something else while we strike hard." Reynolds thought for a moment, then nodded. "Do it." Ryan launched the drones. Small but fast, they moved toward the enemy, firing at weak spots. The enemy turned their weapons toward the drones, giving the Valor a chance to attack. "Fire everything we've got," Reynolds ordered. Missiles launched. Cannons roared again. One by one, the enemy ships started sinking. The plan was working. The enemy fleet was breaking apart. Some ships turned and retreated. Others went down in flames. The U.S. Valor had taken heavy damage, but it was still standing. Reynolds exhaled. "We did it." Ryan nodded, but his face was serious. "We need to check for survivors." Reynolds agreed. "Send out rescue teams and get me a report on our casualties." Back in the medical bay, Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead. The battle was over, but she still had work to do. Mitchell, now able to walk, approached her. "You saved a lot of lives today." Sarah sighed. "Not all of them." Mitchell put a hand on her shoulder. "You did your best. That's what matters." She nodded, but she knew she would never forget the one she couldn't save. Hours later, Reynolds stood on the deck, looking at the open sea. The war wasn't over, but today they had won. Sarah joined him. "What happens now?" Reynolds took a deep breath. "We keep going. We fight when we have to, and we save lives when we can." Sarah looked at the horizon. The U.S. Valor was more than a hospital ship, more than a fortress. It was hope. And as long as it sailed, they would never stop fighting.